Okay, so this is part two of the Constitutional Convention. I'm going to start again because there are three major compromises that came out of the convention. Let's take a look at the vocabulary word of compromise. A compromise is a settlement of differences. Each side gives a little in order to agree. So we've got two sides that really want something, maybe two best friends, for instance, and each of them want something on their pizza or to go to a certain movie. They both have to give up something in order to come to an agreement. If you don't compromise, if you don't agree to something, then usually nothing ever gets done, and then you won't get to go to that movie or eat that pizza. So today we're going to start off with talking about representation or power in voting. This is important because as they were creating this new government, they really tried to figure out what kind of government they wanted. And they were very familiar with Rome and Greece, and they had decided on a republican form of government. So that's kind of what the Constitution sort of guarantees each of the states is this republican form of government. In other words, you get representation. So depending on how many representatives you have, also depends on what kind of voting power you have. The more representatives you have, the more votes you get. The more votes you get, the more power you have. So we're going to look today at the first plan. And the first plan was called the Virginia Plan. And what I'd like for you to do is get out your spiral or some paper, and I'm going to do some drawing with you, and if you'll walk through these notes with me and draw them on your paper, and that way you can turn this in so that we have proof that you've watched the video. So on your paper at the top, go ahead and write down small states versus large states. Okay, so we've got the small states versus the large states. And we'll start with the small states. The small states were small. They don't have a lot of population. They came together and they had decided on their plan. It was called the New Jersey Plan. And because they don't have a lot of people in their states, they believed that the government should create representatives based on one per state. No matter how big or how small your state was, to make it fair, they believed that you should get one per state. So that was pretty much the New Jersey Plan. In other words, each state, it should be what we call equal representation. Okay? Equal representation. In other words, one person or one state equals one vote. Very similar to the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles, each state had its one vote. Well, that's what the small states believe in. They believe regardless of your size, each state should get one vote. That's what we call equal representation. Well, that worked for the small states, but it didn't work for the large states. They believed in something different. They believed that, because they were large and they had a lot of people in their states, that the representation should be based on population, or what we call proportional representation. This plan was called the Virginia Plan. And as we've said before, James Madison came up with this plan, and pretty much what it meant was that because the large states had a lot of people, they believed in what we call proportional representation. In other words, the number of representatives should be based on the population. The more people you have, the more more representation you should have. And just so that we go back up to the top, just to make sure that we're all clear on this, the thing about representation, again, the more representatives you have in Congress equals more votes. Well, the more votes you have in Congress would equal more power. So the large states who have a large population want their representation based on their population. So ultimately, they would have more representatives, they would have more votes, and they would have more power. Well, the small states in New Jersey definitely think that this is not right and it's not equal. They believe in equal representation, or in other words, every state should have one vote, very similar to the Articles of Confederation. The other thing that we have on both sides is that they really talked about the structure of government. The small states believe in a one-house legislator, or one house of Congress, okay? Congress should represent one house, okay? Well, the Virginia plan believed in something different. They actually wanted two houses of Congress. They would like two houses of Congress. So that's also where both of them are different. And as we know, when two sides disagree, one thing that they have to do is compromise. And that's exactly what happens here. Small states versus large states, New Jersey versus Virginia, what we have is we have a compromise. And this compromise is really a big deal, and I think it's funny because it's called the Great Compromise. Now, the Great Compromise, like both of the other two sides, we have to give a little in order to come to a compromise. And that's exactly what happens. What happens is we do get two houses of government. One is called the Senate. One is called the Senate. And one is called the House of Representatives. And that's exactly what we have today. Well, the Senate, and if you know, maybe you don't know, there are 100 senators today, 2 per state. Obviously, we didn't have 50 states back then, but the Senate was going to satisfy what we call the small states. They wanted equal representation. So in the Senate, we're going to have 2 per state. So in other words, this is going to satisfy the small states and their equal representation. Now, the House of Representatives, on the other hand, they are going to be satisfying the large states. The large states, if you remember, was the Virginia plan, and they wanted proportional representation because they have a big population. Well, the House of Representatives is going to be based on population. So, depending on the population of a state would, figure out how many representatives you have. Texas, for instance, I think we have 37 or 36. I'm not exactly sure, but we have quite a few representatives that go to Congress that represent Texas. California is the largest state today, and they have the most representatives. Texas is number 2. We beat out New York a couple of censuses ago. And then you've got New York, and then you've got Florida. And that makes it interesting because, when you talk about the presidential debate, it's the House of Representatives plus the senators that decide on the Electoral College. And so that's why you will see presidential candidates really go to the bigger states and do most of their campaigning or spend most of their money because they're trying to get these votes. But a little bit more on that later. So that is the Great Compromise. All right, if you'll get out another piece of paper, we're going to look at the other compromises. Now, this next compromise really didn't have to do with small versus large state. What it had to do with is this major question on, we've got all this population. How should slaves be counted in the population? You know, states' population is important because it will determine the number of representatives in the House and the amount of taxes states would owe to the central government. That's why this question is kind of important. How should slaves be counted in this population? So instead of a large versus small state issue, what it became, honestly, is a North versus South issue. And pretty much the reason why is because the North only has a few number of slaves. They only have a few number of slaves. And because they have a few number of slaves, they do not want to count the slaves for the population. They do not want to count them for population. In other words, they do not want the South, because they have slaves, to have more representatives, ultimately more power, than the North. But because they don't want the slaves to count for population, they would like the slaves to count for taxes. They do want the slaves to equal taxes. At this time, of course, you know, however many people you have, that's how much states' taxes were. We taxed, you know, incomes and that kind of stuff. No, actually, I'm sorry, not incomes, property taxes. So they do want the slaves to count toward taxes. Okay, well, the South, on the other hand, where the North has few slaves, the South has many slaves. And where the North does not want them count toward population, the South does. So the South does want slaves to count for population. They think that, you know, that they have more people, they should have more representatives, and representatives equals more power. They do want their slaves to count toward population. But they do not want their slaves to count for taxes. So in other words, they want them to count for representation, but they don't want them to count for taxes. And like we said, what do we do when two sides disagree? We have to compromise, and that's exactly what we do. This one is called the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise. And pretty much what it means is that both sides are going to sort of get a little, okay? For every 5 slaves you have, 3 of them are going to count. 3 of them will count towards population and for taxes. And that's the great compromise. And as you can see, both sides do get something out of it. So 3/5 compromise. The slaves will count, 3/5 of the slaves will count toward population and for taxes. So that's the second compromise. Now the third compromise has to do with what are we going to do with trade, slave trade in particular, and runaway slaves. And that, of course, leads us to the third compromise. So on another sheet of paper, let's go ahead, and this issue, of course, is not large versus small. This one still is North versus South. And in this North versus South, you have, of course, the North, and you've